Everyone gave up on him. That is the part nobody talks about,
Interesting.
not in polite company, not in the boardrooms where his name still makes men straighten their spines out of instinct, not in the
Interesting.
crime syndicate circles where his legend got told like a ghost story to new recruits who had never seen his face. They
Interesting.
gave up on Ryu Seong-min quietly, the way powerful people do when someone they built their authority around becomes
Interesting.
inconvenient to believe in. 20 years in a wheelchair. 20 years of the empire he built
Interesting.
running on the fear of a man who could no longer stand to enforce it. And for 20 years, every doctor,
Interesting.
every specialist, every neurologist flown in from Tokyo and Zurich and New York had said the same thing in different
Interesting.
languages with the same careful expression. There is nothing more we can do. Welcome to Afro-Korean
Interesting.
Wave. Please like, share, and subscribe. She was not supposed to be there.
Interesting.
That is the thing about Zara Williams that nobody who knew her story would argue with,
Interesting.
because Zara had a very specific talent for ending up in rooms she was not supposed to be
Interesting.
in and refusing with complete calm and zero apology to leave them.
Interesting.
She was 29 years old, a physical rehabilitation specialist who had trained in Seoul on a research
Interesting.
fellowship, and then stayed because the hospital had offered her a contract, and the apartment was
Interesting.
affordable, and because, if she was honest with herself, she had no particular reason to go back to Atlanta
Interesting.
when Seoul had started to feel like the city that was waiting for her all along. She was
Interesting.
curvy and warm-skinned and had the kind of eyes that noticed everything, quiet and
Interesting.
quick, and a little bit devastating if you were the person she was paying attention to. She wore her
Interesting.
natural hair in a high puff on clinic days and had a laugh that arrived without warning and
Interesting.
took up all available space in whatever room she was in. The referral came through a
Interesting.
channel she did not fully understand, filtered through 3 layers of hospital administration, until it reached her
Interesting.
desk as simply a private patient with complex neurological paralysis, incomplete spinal injury,
Interesting.
20 years post-incident, willing to pay for an intensive 12-week evaluation and rehabilitation assessment.
Interesting.
The fee listed was a number that made Zara read the document twice, and then set it down and look at the wall of her office for a long moment. That was not a hospital fee. That was a number that meant someone had decided this was worth any price and had not bothered to negotiate because negotiating implied a ceiling and this particular patient did not operate within ceilings. She accepted the referral on a Tuesday, which meant the following Monday she walked into a private residence in the hills above Seoul that she had been driven to in a black car by a man named Director Shin, who had the specific composure of someone who had been working for a very particular kind of employer for a very long time, and had learned that composure was both a professional skill and a survival strategy. The house was not what she expected. Not a mansion in the way she had been bracing for, not the kind of place that announced its wealth
Interesting.
aggressively. It was understated and precisely arranged and felt like a space that had been built by someone who
Interesting.
valued control over impression. Every surface was clean. Every line was intentional.
Interesting.
The kind of house that a person creates when their external environment is the only thing they can still
Interesting.
govern completely. He was by the window when she entered the main room. That was the first thing she
Interesting.
registered, not the wheelchair, not the stillness of his legs, but the fact that he had positioned himself by the window with the deliberate
Interesting.
calculation of someone who had decided long ago that if they could not move through the world, they would at least be able to watch it.
Interesting.
Ryu Seong-min was 51 years old and looked like a man who had been carved specifically to make other people
Interesting.
feel uncertain. He was broad-shouldered in the way that 20 years of upper body strength
Interesting.
does to a man, his jaw sharp, his dark eyes carrying the particular quality of
Interesting.
someone who had spent 2 decades sitting still while the world moved around him and had used all that
Interesting.
stillness to become very, very good at reading it. He wore a dark gray shirt
Interesting.
with the sleeves pushed to the elbows, and he was looking at Zara with the expression of a man who had been
Interesting.
told she was coming, and had decided in advance that she would be exactly like all the
Interesting.
others. A person with credentials and good intentions and the same carefully worded exit
Interesting.
strategy everyone else had eventually deployed. She said, "Good morning." He did not
Interesting.
say anything back. She set her bag down, which was a large professional bag with a worn strap and a small enamel pin on the zipper that said, "Ask me about neuroplasticity," which he clocked immediately and which made something flicker across his expression so quickly she almost missed it. Almost. She pulled out her clipboard. "I'm going to ask you a series of questions and then I am going to do a physical assessment," she said in Korean because his file had listed Korean as his primary language and she had been in Seoul long enough to operate in it fluently. "After that I will tell you what I actually think, not what you want to hear, not what my predecessors apparently told you. What I actually think." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said in English, because he had clearly noted that her Korean carried a particular Atlantic cadence, and had decided to observe her response to that specific choice. "You are very confident for someone who has not looked at me for more than 30 seconds. She switched back to Korean without missing a beat. "I have been looking at you since I walked in the door. You have been sitting in that position for at least an hour before I arrived based on the muscle tension pattern in your left shoulder. You favor the right side of the window even though the light is better on the left, which tells me the right view means something specific to you. And you are wearing compression sleeve supports on both forearms that are not standard issue, which means you ordered them custom, which means you have been managing your upper body load independently for long enough to have developed specific preferences about support. She looked up from the clipboard, so I have been looking. I simply have not been starring. The silence that followed was the most interesting silence Zara had encountered in her professional career, and she had been doing this work for 7 years. It was not hostile. It was not the silence of a man deciding whether to dismiss her. It was the silence of a man who had not been surprised in a very long time and was sitting inside the experience of being surprised and deciding what to do with it. He said, "Ask your questions." The assessment took 2 hours. She did not soften the findings. She did not perform the careful clinical dance she had watched other practitioners do in his presence, the one where you delivered hard information in such a cushioned way that the actual information got lost entirely. She told him that the level of deterioration in the lower limb neural pathways was significant but not, in her assessment, irreversible. She told him that the previous evaluations she had reviewed had, in her professional opinion, relied too heavily on the absence of early-stage recovery as a predictor of long-term outcome, and that there was specific emerging research on late-stage incomplete spinal injury rehabilitation that had not been applied to his case because it was recent, and because his previous medical team had closed the file years before the research existed. She told him that she was not promising him anything. She told him that a 12-week assessment was exactly that, an assessment, not a guarantee, and that what she could promise him was that she would tell him the truth at every stage and he would never have to wonder whether she was managing his expectations to protect herself. He had been looking at her throughout this with the kind of attention that most people found uncomfortable. Zara did not find it uncomfortable. She found it specific, the way she found most things specific, and she filed the observation away with everything else she had collected in the 2 hours since she arrived. When she finished, he was quiet again. Then he said, "Every other specialist has told me the window closed 15 years ago." She looked at him directly. "They were not wrong based on what they knew when they told you that. I am telling you that the window may not be as closed as everyone decided it was. There is a difference." He studied her with those dark eyes and she did not look away, and the thing that moved between them in that moment was not the thing either of them would have named because neither of them was in the habit of naming things before they had been examined carefully. He said, "When do we start?" She said, "We already did." The first week was professional and precise and completely without incident if you did not count the 3 separate occasions on which members of his security staff attempted to monitor her sessions, and she asked them, politely and with complete firmness, to wait outside. The second time she had to ask, the one she came to know as Kim, a broad-faced man with the bearing of someone who had been standing between Ryu Seong-min and the rest of the world for a significant portion of his adult life, had looked at her with the expression of someone whose authority had not been directly challenged in recent memory. She had looked back at him with the expression of a woman who considered this particular challenge to be well within the scope of her professional standards. He had stepped outside. He had not looked happy about it. Seong-min, from the treatment table, had watched the exchange with the careful attention he brought to all things and had said nothing. But when the door closed, she caught the edge of something at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile and was not quite not a smile either. The sessions themselves were intense and methodical, and built on a framework that Zara had developed over years of working with patients who had been told no and had chosen to interpret that as a provisional answer rather than a permanent one. She worked his neural pathways with a combination of manual therapy and electrical stimulation and specific movement sequences that were designed not to produce immediate dramatic results, but to build the micro-level communication channels that were the prerequisite for anything larger. She explained every step in real time, not because she thought he needed the explanation but because she had observed in the first session that Seong-min was the kind of person who needed to understand the mechanism of what was happening to him to trust it, and that trusting it was a prerequisite to his full participation, and that his full participation was what would determine whether any of this worked. She was right about all of it. He asked questions that told her each time that he had been doing independent research between sessions. Specific questions, the kind that only arrived after someone had spent hours reading primary literature and then come back with the gaps. She answered them thoroughly and without condescension, and on the 4th day he asked a question about a specific study on sensory grading in late-stage incomplete injuries that she had to sit with for a moment before she answered because it was a genuinely good question, and she wanted to give it a genuinely good answer. He noticed the pause. He always noticed everything. "What is it?" he said. She said, "That is actually a more sophisticated question than most of my colleagues would ask." He looked at her with those dark eyes. "I have been studying this for 20 years." She said, "I know, and it shows. which means you already have a framework for what I am about to say, so I will not simplify it, and she did not. By the end of the second week, something had shifted in the texture of the sessions. It was not dramatic, it did not announce itself. It was more the way a room changes when the light moves, the same room but with different shadows, and suddenly everything that was always there is visible in a new way. He had started talking between the technical portions of the sessions. Not personal things, not initially, but observations. About the garden visible from the window she worked near. About a book he had been reading whose premise he disagreed with. About the way the city sounded different in the hours before dawn versus the hours after. He talked the way someone talks when they have been alone with their thoughts for so long that external conversation has become a specific pleasure they are relearning how to hold. Zara listened, which she was exceptionally good at, and responded, which she was also good at, and did not make anything of it beyond what it was, which was a man who was beginning to let his guard down by increments so small they were barely measurable. The increments mattered. She had learned early in her career that the increments were always what mattered. It was in the third week that the first significant neural response appeared. She was working through a sensory discrimination sequence, applying graduated pressure along the dermatome pathways in his lower left leg, which had shown the most dormant but structurally intact nerve clusters in her initial mapping, when he went still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. She stopped immediately. "What was that?" she said. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, which was the expression of someone who was not sure whether what they were about to say was real or a product of hope so long suppressed that it had learned to disguise itself as sensation. "Something," he said quietly. She moved her hand 2 centimeters and applied precisely the same pressure. Again he said, "The same specific area." He said, "Yes." She made a note in her clinical record with the careful precision of someone documenting something that could be very important and needed to be documented without urgency so that the documentation reflected exactly what had happened rather than what she hoped it meant. Then she looked up at him. He was looking at his own leg with the expression of a man standing at the edge of something he had stopped believing was there. She said in the quietest professional voice she had, "That was real. That is your nervous system. That is not nothing." He did not look up. He continued looking at his leg with that expression for a long moment. And then he said with the controlled flatness of a man who had trained himself out of hopping for a very long time, "Is it enough?" She said, "I told you I would always tell you the truth." He looked up then, those dark eyes finding hers. She said, "It is a beginning. In my experience, beginnings are the hardest part to manufacture. What comes after is work, but this part you cannot manufacture. This happened because your nervous system has more to say than everyone decided it did." He looked at her for a moment longer than any of their previous exchanges had required. Then he looked back at his leg and said nothing, and the nothing he said had a different quality than all the previous nothings, and she recognized it for what it was. A man allowing himself to feel something he had been defending against for 20 years. She made a note that the session had run 15 minutes over, and then she made a second note that she had not noticed until she was writing the first one. The conversation about his past arrived on a Thursday evening in week 4. She had not asked for it. She had learned very early that Ryu Seong-min did not offer things because they were asked for. He offered them when he had decided they were ready to be offered, which was a process internal to him that she had stopped trying to predict because prediction implied a pattern and he did not operate in patterns. He waited until she had finished the session notes and was packing her bag, and he said, "Without preamble, you have not asked me how it happened." She continued packing her bag. "I don't need to know to do my job." He said, "Everyone asks eventually." She said, "I am not everyone." He said, "I know." It was the first time he had said something to her that had no clinical or operational purpose at all. She stilled for a moment, then continued packing and said, "You can tell me if you want to." He looked at the window. He said that 20 years ago he had been in the wrong place at the specific wrong moment, and that the bullet had been meant for someone else, and that the person it had been meant for was not someone he would tell her about because that part of the story belonged to a version of his life he did not revisit. She did not push. She said, "The why it happened doesn't change what we do now." He looked at her from the window. He said, "No one has ever said that to me before either." She picked up her bag. "Most people make the injury about its origin. You are not the origin. You are the person who has been living with the outcome. That is what I am here for." She went to the door. She said, "Good session today. The response in that nerve cluster has improved measurably since Tuesday." She left without waiting for him to respond, which was, as she had learned, the specific move that worked best with Ryu Seong-min, because he was a man who had spent his life being the last to speak in every room, and he needed to be with his thoughts after things landed, and leaving gave him that without either of them having to name it. She was in the elevator going down before she acknowledged to herself that her hands were not entirely steady. Which was the first time in 4 weeks that had happened during a professional interaction. She noted it the way she noted everything, without judgment, with precision, and filed it next to the other observations she had been collecting and not yet named. Kim was waiting for her in the lobby as he had been every evening for 4 weeks. He was the one who organized her transportation, and he had evolved over the 4 weeks from openly suspicious to neutrally watchful to something that she might have called, if pressed, grudging. He did not say much. He had said in week 2 that the boss had not talked this much in years, and then he had closed his mouth with the expression of a man who had said more than he intended, and was deciding whether to walk it back. She had not acknowledged it, which she suspected was the correct move, and the following day he had been waiting with a coffee in the exact way she took it, which she had not told anyone in the household, which meant he had paid attention himself. She had accepted the coffee without comment, and he had not commented either, and that had been the entirety of the exchange, but it had settled something between them that she could not have precisely named. It was in week 5 that the thing outside her professional parameters first occurred, which was that she was working through an evening session that had run late because they had hit a productive sequence, and stopping in the middle of a productive sequence when both of them were locked in on it felt clinically irresponsible, and he had asked Director Shin to have dinner brought rather than having her leave and come back in the morning. She had said that was not necessary. He had said that it was efficient. She had considered the clinical value of an uninterrupted session versus the thing that a shared dinner meant in the context of a professional relationship, and had decided that the clinical value was real, and the other thing could be examined later, and had said fine. The dinner was brought by staff who materialized and dematerialized with the efficiency of people who had been running this household for a long time and had learned to do it invisibly. The food was exceptional. She ate and they continued talking about the session, and then gradually, without either of them engineering it, they stopped talking about the session and were simply talking, which was a thing that she had not done in a while, simply talked over food, with someone who found the same specific things interesting that she found interesting and disagreed with the same precise clarity that she disagreed with things, and did not manage his responses to accommodate what she might want to hear. She drove herself home that night, which she always did on late evenings because she had her own car and preferred driving to being driven when the hour was late and the city was quiet, and she sat in the parking garage of her apartment building for a moment before getting out and said to herself, in the plainest possible internal language, "You need to be careful." And then she got out of the car because she was not the kind of person who let the need to be careful become the reason to be afraid. The danger arrived in week 6 in a way she had not anticipated, which was the only way danger ever arrived in the vicinity of Ryu Seong-min. It arrived as a man named Park Di-sung, who was apparently an old associate of Seong-min's from the organizational years, and who had apparently decided that Seong-min's current condition made him an accessible target in ways he had not been for decades, and who had apparently also decided that the best lever was the new therapist whose presence in the household had, he had noted through channels that Zara was not in the habit of considering, become significant. She found this out because Kim told her. He told her on a Wednesday morning in the parking area of the residence with the expression of a man who had decided that she needed to know and that the decision about how to tell her was secondary to the fact of the telling. "There is a man," Kim said, "who has been making inquiries about you. Your qualifications, your address in Atlanta, your family there." She looked at him. He said, "It is connected to the boss, people who want leverage." She processed this for a moment. Then she said, "Does Seong-min know?" Kim said yes. She said, "What did he say?" Kim's expression changed slightly, not much, just at the corners. "He said to make sure you were told and that he had already handled it and that you did not need to concern yourself." She said, "I see." Kim said, "He has also arranged additional security for your residential building." She said, "Without my knowledge or permission." Kim said, "Yes." She stood there in the morning air and breathed through the specific mixture of feelings that created, which she was not going to examine in a parking garage. Then she said, "That was presumptuous." Kim said, "Yes." She said, "I am going to tell him that when I go upstairs." Kim said, "I expected you would." She did tell him. She walked into the main room where he was already set up for the session and she said, "I understand you arranged security for my building without asking me." He looked at her with the composed expression he deployed when he had done something he was not going to apologize for and knew she knew it. "Yes," he said. She said, "That is my home, my life. You do not make decisions about my life without consulting me." He said, "There is a man who is targeting you because of your proximity to me. Security is not a decision about your life. It is a response to a threat to it." She said, "The distinction matters." He said, "I agree." He did not look like he agreed. She said, "You should have told me and then given me the choice." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I should have." She had been prepared for several possible responses and had not prepared for that specific one, and the preparation gap showed on her face for approximately 1 second before she managed it. He watched the 1 second with the careful attention he brought to all small revelations. She said, "Thank you." He said, "I will tell you next time." She said, "There will not be a next time if you tell me." He said, "There might be." His life did not tend toward the uncomplicated. She had figured that out. She said, "I know." She set down her bag and began setting up the session. The moment resolved into the familiar rhythm of the work, and neither of them spoke about it again, but it sat between them, warm and specific, The way things sit between people who have crossed a line they cannot uncross and have decided without discussing it that they are not going back. Week 7 brought the first significant movement. She had been anticipating it the way you anticipate something you are trying not to hope for too loudly in case hopping changes the conditions of the thing. She had been working the progressive loading sequences for 3 weeks, building the neural communication architecture with the steady patience that she had trained herself into because impatience in rehabilitation was not a character flaw. It was a clinical liability, and she had decided very early in her career that her patients deserved a practitioner without clinical liabilities. On a Tuesday afternoon in week 7, in the middle of a facilitated weight-bearing sequence that required Seong-min to hold a specific position at the parallel bars she had installed in the ground floor rehabilitation space at her request and director Shin's efficient arrangement, he took a step. It was not the kind of step that would appear in a motivational video about recovery. It was a dragging, effortful, technically imperfect redistribution of weight that moved his right foot approximately 12 centimeters forward, and required everything he had and produced a sound from him that was not voluntary, a sharp, controlled exhale that he immediately contained. But it was a step. She stood at the end of the bars and looked at him, and he was looking at the foot that had moved with an expression she had only seen on him once before, on the day the first nerve response appeared. The expression of a man at the edge of something he had stopped believing in. She said in the quietest voice she had, "Do it again." He did it again, 12 centimeters, the same effortful drag, the same contained exhale. He looked up at her and she looked at him and she said, still in the same quiet voice, "Do you understand what just happened?" He said, "Yes." She said, "I need you to say it." He said, "I walked." She said, "Yes, you did." They looked at each other across the parallel bars in the rehabilitative space of his own house, and she felt the thing she had been filing very carefully for 7 weeks arrive at the surface all at once. The specific weight of having believed in someone when they had stopped believing in themselves and watching the belief resolve into something real. She managed it. She managed it by looking at her clinical notes and writing down the exact measurement and the exact time and the exact technical parameters of what had occurred with the precision she brought to all documentation. When she looked up, he was still at the bars and his knuckles were white on the rails, and his jaw was set with the control of a man who was containing something enormous and doing it with everything he had. She said, "We need to build on this before we do anything else." He said, "Yes." She said, "This is going to be harder than what we just did." He said, "I know." She said, "Are you ready?" He said, "I have been ready for 20 years." She said, "I know that too." She moved to the bar beside him and they went back to work, and neither of them said anything that was not clinically necessary for the rest of the session. And when it was over and he was back in the chair and she was documenting and the room had the quiet of two people who had just been through something together, he said without looking at her, "Thank you." She said, "We did this together." He said, "No, I have had other therapists." He looked at her. "You are the only one who made me believe the window was still open." She looked back at him. She said, "The window was always open. Everyone else just stopped looking." The shift after that was irreversible in the way that certain shifts are, the ones that cannot be undone by returning to the previous position because the previous position has been altered by the shift. She noticed it in herself first, which was how she always noticed things from the inside out. She noticed that the drive to the residence in the mornings had started carrying a quality that was different from the quality of driving to a clinical appointment. She noticed that she was paying attention to his laugh, which was rare and low and entirely genuine when it arrived, in a way that was not clinical. She noticed that she was thinking about the things he said in the hours after sessions ended, turning them over the way you turn over the things that matter. She noticed all of this and she examined it with the same precision she brought to everything, and she arrived at the conclusion that she had arrived at the edge of the thing she had told herself to be careful about and had, apparently, walked straight in anyway. She did not act on it. She was a professional and he was her patient, and those were not incidental facts. But she also did not pretend it away, because pretending things away was the kind of thing that produced clinical errors and personal disasters in equal measure, and she was not in the business of either. He noticed too. She could tell he noticed the way she could tell everything he noticed, which was the specific quality of his attention when it moved from the clinical to the personal, a slight change in the angle of his gaze, a held breath, a precision in the stillness that had a different origin than his usual precision. He did not act on it either. He was, she had come to understand, a man who had spent his life operating in the space between what he wanted and what the situation required, and he had become very good at holding that space without allowing it to collapse in either direction. But the space had changed. It was smaller now, warmer, and both of them knew it. The second incident related to Park Ji-sung arrived without warning on a Friday evening when Zara had stayed late because they had been in the middle of a documentation review, and losing the thread before finishing it felt wasteful. She was in the study with Seong-min going through the progress charts when the alert came through to Kim, who appeared in the doorway with the expression of a man managing several things at once and managing them with the controlled efficiency of someone who had been doing this for a very long time. "Something is happening at the south gate," Kim said to Seong-min. "I need 2 minutes." Seong-min looked at Zara. "Go to the inner room," he said. "I know that sounds like an overreaction," she said, "does it?" Kim was already moving. She went to the inner room, which was a comfortable room off the main corridor that she had learned in week 3 was the secure room of the house, the one built to specific specifications that she had not asked about. She sat down and did not perform any of the panic behaviors she might have performed because panic was not, historically, a response she defaulted to, and also because she was busy thinking very clearly about the specific situation she was in, which was that she was sitting in the secure room of a man who ran a criminal organization and felt entirely certain that she was safe, which was an interesting data point about both of them. It was 12 minutes. Kim came back and told her it had been a probe, an attempt to test the perimeter security by Park Ji-sung's people that had been stopped and handled. She asked what handled meant. Kim looked at her with the expression of a man deciding how much detail to provide to someone who was asking a genuine question in a situation where the genuine answer was complicated. Seong-min's voice came from the doorway. "It means they left." She looked at him in the doorway of the secure room in his wheelchair with his jaw set and his eyes on her with the specific quality she had learned to read as concern that he was managing rather than showing. "It means they will not come back," she said. "How do you know?" he said. "Because I made it clear what coming back would cost them." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Are you all right?" The question surprised him. She could tell because his expression did the thing it did when she surprised him, the small recalibration, the pause before response. He said yes. She said, "I am asking because it was your house and your perimeter and your history with these people, and I am asking how you are, not whether the situation is resolved." He looked at her across the small space of the secure room, and the space between them was approximately 2 meters, and also approximately nothing at all. He said in a voice that was quieter than his usual voice, "I am fine." He said it with the specific inflection of a man for whom fine is not always the answer but is the answer he has available right now. She said, "Okay." She picked up her bag, which she had brought into the room with her because she was practical. She said, "We should finish the documentation review." He said, "Zara." She looked at him. He said, "Thank you for not making this into something larger than it needs to be right now." She said, "I will make it larger later when you are ready for that conversation." He said, "That is a very specific kind of threat." She said, "I prefer to think of it as a scheduled discussion." Something moved in his expression, warm and precise, and she walked past him into the corridor and went back to the study, and after a moment he followed and they finished the documentation, and she drove home and sat in her parking garage again, and this time she did not say anything to herself in the quiet because the thing she would have said was too specific to say alone in a car in a parking garage. She said it later in her apartment to the dark outside her window. "I am in it," she said. And she did not sound afraid when she said it, which told her something about herself that she filed carefully next to everything else. Week 9 brought a conversation that could not have happened in any earlier week, because both of them had needed the preceding 8 weeks to arrive at it. She had come for a morning session and found him at the window as she often did, except that this morning he was not at the window in the usual way, with the composed observational quality she had come to know. He was at the window differently, and she registered the difference before she registered anything else because reading a room was something she did without thinking. The way she had been trained, and then the way she had trained herself after training wasn't enough anymore. She set her bag down. She did not begin the session setup. She went to stand near him, not beside him, near him, the same distance she stood when she wanted to be close enough to be available without being close enough to intrude. He said, "I was told last night that my organization has been operating under a man named Cho for most of the past 15 years, and that Cho has been making agreements that leverage my name without my knowledge or consent." She said, "What does that mean for you?" He said, "It means that the thing I gave 20 years of my life to building has been used as a tool by someone I trusted and that I am going to have to decide what I want to do about that." She said, "That is a large decision." He said, "Yes." She said, "Is it a decision you need to make alone?" He was quiet for a long moment. He said, "I don't know how to make it any other way. I have been making decisions alone for 20 years. She said, "I know." She said it gently, the way she said things when they were true and heavy at the same time. She said, "You don't have to anymore." He turned to look at her and she met his gaze without looking away because she had stopped looking away from him some time ago and had not particularly marked the moment when it happened because it had felt like something that was already the case and was simply being confirmed. He said, "You are not afraid of what I am." It was not quite a question. She said, "I know what you are. I have known for 9 weeks. I know who you built yourself into and I know the cost of it and I know the kind of man who survives that cost, and I have been watching you every day for 9 weeks, and what I see is someone who has been waiting a very long time to choose who he is next." He said nothing. She said, I am not telling you what to choose. That is yours. I am just telling you that you have the option and that I can see it even when you can't. He looked at her for a long moment with everything in his face that he usually kept behind the composed surface, and she received it the way she received things, fully, without flinching, with the steady open attention that was the specific thing she brought to the world. He said, you are one of the most unusual people I have ever encountered. She said, I will take that. He said, it is not a complaint. She said, I know. He reached across the space between them, the small, precise space, and he took her hand, which was resting on the window ledge, and he held it with the particular carefulness of a man who is holding something he does not want to break and is aware that the carefulness itself communicates everything. She felt the warmth of his hand around hers and did not move and did not speak and let the moment be exactly what it was, which was the thing that had been building for 9 weeks, arriving quietly and without ceremony and not needing any. They stayed like that for a long time. The city moved outside the window and neither of them moved inside it, and it was enough for now to be here, to have arrived at this, to have the window open after everyone else had closed it. The confrontation with Park Dae-sung's people did not come to Zara directly. It came to Seong-min through a message delivered through channels she would not have known how to access, which was that Dae-sung had decided the most effective pressure was not on Seong-min himself but on the woman in his house, and that he had located Zara's family in Atlanta, her mother and her 2 younger brothers, and that this information was being presented as a reminder that power had many addresses. Seong-min told her himself. He did not have Kim tell her. He did not have it delivered through an intermediary. He told her directly on a morning in week 10 before the session began, with the expression of a man who has decided that the truth delivered by him is better than the truth arriving by any other route. She sat with it, she processed it. Then she said, what have you done about it? He said, I have people moving to Atlanta tonight. I have already spoken to the security firm my organization has operated with for 15 years, and they have people in your mother's neighborhood before morning. He said, I am telling you this time. She said, yes. She said, thank you for telling me. He said, I need you to know that this is not a situation I will leave unresolved. She said, I know. She said, I also need you to know that I am not going anywhere because of this. He looked at her with something in his eyes that was too large for the room. She said, I came here to do a job that I believed in, and I am not the kind of person who leaves because someone decides to use me as a leverage point. I am the kind of person who calls that unacceptable and then continues. He said, calling it unacceptable is different from being safe. She said, both things are true. She looked at him. She said, go handle it. He said, I am going to. She said, I will be here when you're back. He looked at her for one more moment with everything, that specific everything, and then he went to handle it. He was back by mid-afternoon. He said it was finished. She did not ask what finished meant in this context because she had made a decision in the preceding weeks about the things she could hold and the things she needed to examine from a distance, and she had filed this particular kind of finished in the latter category for now, with the understanding that later was when she would look at it more carefully. She said, is my family safe? He said, completely. She said, thank you. He said, do not thank me. She said, I am going to anyway. He looked at her. She looked back. The thing between them had resolved over the weeks into something that did not need much maintenance or much language. It simply existed in the space between them when they were in the same room, warm and gravitational and entirely specific. Week 11, he walked from the bars to the window, not dragging, not the effortful 12-centimeter shuffle of week 7, but walking. It was slow, it was imperfect. His right side was stronger than his left, and she would work on that asymmetry for months. She already knew it, she was already planning for it. But he walked to the window and stood at it on his own legs and looked out at the view he had been looking at from a chair for 20 years, and she stood behind him and watched him do it and let the moment be as large as it was, which was the largest thing she had witnessed in her professional life, and also the largest thing she had witnessed as a person. And she had decided some time ago that she was not going to separate those two categories when it came to Ryu Seong-min, because separating them would require pretending he was not both, and she did not pretend things. He stood there for a long time. She did not rush him. After a while he said, without turning around, I did not think I would ever do this again. She said, I know. He said, you believed it was possible before I did. She said, yes. He turned around, which was slow and required the cane she had put in his hand before he started the walk, and he looked at her from the window. He said, why? She said, because the evidence was there. He said, no one else saw it. She said, I am not everyone else. He looked at her with the expression that had no name in the vocabulary either of them had available and said, no, you are not. He crossed the room back toward her, slow and deliberate and real, and stood in front of her, and the space between them was nothing at all now, and she looked up at him standing on his own legs for the first time in 20 years, and he looked at her and he said, I have been wanting to say something to you for approximately 5 weeks, and I have been not saying it because the timing has not been right, and because I am aware of the professional parameters of what we are to each other, and because I do not want to make the professional parameters the reason I say something that has nothing to do with professional parameters. She said, say it. He said in the quiet, flat, entirely certain voice of a man who has decided completely, I do not want you to leave when this assessment is finished. She looked at him. She said in the same quiet, I was not planning to. He said, I am not talking about the clinical relationship. She said, I know. He said, are you saying you will stay? She said, I am saying I already have. He looked at her with the full, open version of himself, the one that had been appearing more frequently over the past weeks as the careful, composed surface had softened into something more present and more real. And he put his hand against her face, the same careful hand, and she covered it with hers, and they stood like that in the room where she had spent 11 weeks pulling him back toward his own life and which had, in the process, become something to her that she would not have predicted when she walked into it on a Monday morning with a clipboard and an enamel pin about neuroplasticity. She stood on her toes and kissed him, and he held her with both hands like someone holding something they were not letting go of. And the city moved outside the window, and in the room it was entirely still and entirely real and entirely theirs. The 12th week was not the last. Director Shin had assumed it would be, had begun the paperwork for the conclusion of the assessment contract, and Zara had let him proceed until the Wednesday of that week when she sat down with him and said very simply that she would be continuing to work with Seong-min on an ongoing basis, and that the parameters of the engagement would need to be restructured accordingly. Director Shin had looked at her with the expression of a man who had suspected something of this nature was developing for several weeks and had been waiting to see how it resolved. He said, yes, Dr. Williams, and that had been, in Director Shin's efficient style, the entire discussion. Park Ji-sung's resolution arrived in week 13, not as violence, which was what Zara had been bracing for in the part of herself she acknowledged quietly, but as a capitulation. Seong-min did not explain the mechanism. He came to her on a Tuesday morning walking with the cane, his gait stronger on both sides than it had been, and he said that Ji-sung's organization had been made aware that the cost of continuing to target Seong-min's household was not a cost they were equipped to sustain and that they had made the rational calculation accordingly. She said, are you sure it's finished? He said, yes. She said, and Cho. He said, Cho is no longer part of the organization in any capacity. She said, what does that mean? He looked at her with the careful gaze he used when he was giving her accurate information without the detail that would require context she did not have. She said, you don't have to tell me the detail. He said, I want to. She said, then tell me. He told her. She sat with it. She said, are you all right with what you had to do? He said, no. She said, is that the answer you expected to give? He said, 2 years ago, yes. Now, no. She said, that is the right direction. He said, you are very specific in your assessments. She said, it is what you pay me for. He looked at her with the warm, private expression that was entirely hers. He said, among other things. She looked back and did not hide what was in her eyes when she did, which was the full version of the thing she had stopped hiding some time ago, and they were both exactly where they were supposed to be. She called her mother in Atlanta that evening. She had not told her mother much about the specifics of the past 13 weeks. Her mother was a perceptive woman who had spent 30 years reading her daughter and who had been saying for 3 of those years that Zara needed to let something in. When Zara said she had something to tell her, her mother said before she had said anything further, is he good to you? Zara looked out her apartment window at Seoul in the evening. She said, yes, Mama. Extraordinarily so, her mother said. Then what else is there to discuss? She said, he has a complicated past. Her mother said, baby, show me a man over 50 without one. She said, he is specifically Korean and previously a very powerful and not entirely legitimate figure in Seoul's organizational landscape. Her mother said, I know who he is. Zara went still. She said, what? Her mother said, when some people came around our neighborhood a few months back and then other people came around clearly keeping an eye on us, I asked your brother to do some research. She said, Mama. Her mother said, Zara Celestine Williams, I have been your mother for 29 years. You think I don't know how to pay attention to the important things? She said, what did you find? Her mother said, we found a man who has been described as dangerous by people who clearly needed to describe him as dangerous to justify being afraid of him. And we found a man whose staff drove 3 hours out of their way to make sure my garden lights were working properly during the security detail, which tells me something more specific than any description. Zara laughed. She said, Mama. Her mother said, bring him to Atlanta when he is ready. I would like to meet the man who my daughter has not called sounding like that in 4 years. Zara said, sounding like what? Her mother said, like yourself. She sat with that for a long time after she hung up. She told Seong-min the next day. She told him her mother had researched him, which he received with the expression of a man who found this information both alarming and in some specific way that she could see him working out deeply appealing. She said, she wants to meet you. He said, in Atlanta. She said, yes. He said, I have not traveled internationally in a considerable amount of time. She said, you could. He said, when I am ready. She said, yes. He looked at her with the expression that had become one of her specific favorite things about his face, the one where the composed surface and the warm reality underneath were both fully present at the same time, each making the other more visible. He said, what is she like? She said, imagine someone who finds me entirely transparent. He said, that must be very unusual. She said, it is exclusively her. He said, I think I will like her. She said, she will probably terrify you slightly. He said, that seems right for the mother of someone like you. The day Seong-min walked into the garden was a Saturday in early spring. Zara had not planned it for a specific day because rehabilitation milestones did not obey planning, and she had learned that the moment you planned for them was the moment they refused to arrive on schedule. But it was a Saturday and the light was the specific warm light of early Seoul spring, and he had been building toward it for weeks, and on that Saturday morning something was simply ready. Kim saw it happen from the doorway. He stood there with the expression of a man who had been waiting for this specific sight for longer than he would have admitted to anyone, and when Seong-min walked through the garden door with the cane and stood in the morning air with the light on his face, Kim made a sound that was not professional at all and then immediately reassembled his composure, which did not entirely reassemble, and walked away to give them the garden. Zara stood beside Seong-min in the morning light and felt the warmth of it on her own face, and beside her he was breathing the outside air on his own legs for the first time in 20 years, and neither of them said anything for a long time because the moment was not a moment that needed language. It was a moment that needed to be stood inside fully, which they did, side by side in the early spring garden of his house, her hand in his. The city of Seoul went about its Saturday, and in the garden on the hill it was entirely still and entirely enough and entirely theirs. He proposed on a Tuesday evening 6 months later, not in a dramatic public gesture, not in a restaurant with a view. He proposed in the kitchen of his house at 9 in the evening when she was eating the leftovers of the dinner they had made together, and he had been watching her with the specific quality of attention she had catalogued since week 1, and he said, with no preamble and no ceremony because ceremony was not his language, I want you to marry me. She looked up from the container she was eating out of. She said, that was not a question. He said, no. He said, I am telling you what I want and I am hoping you want it too. She looked at him for a moment. He was standing in the kitchen of his own house on his own legs, which he did every day now, steadier on the left than he had been 3 months ago, the asymmetry she was still working on and would continue to work on because the work did not have a finish line and she had stopped wanting it to. She said, I want it too. He looked at her with everything. She said, you should know that my mother is going to have opinions about the ceremony. He said, I expected as much. She said, she has already sent me a document. He said, a document. She said, 11 pages. He looked at her. She looked back. They were both smiling, which was, she had learned, the natural consequence of being in each other's presence for long enough that the gravity between them had somewhere warmed to land. He said, I suppose we should call her. She said, she is going to cry and then tell you that she knew from the garden lights. He said, the garden lights. She said, I will explain later. He said, come here. She set down the container and went to him, and he held her with both arms in the kitchen of his house that was becoming her house by degree, and she put her face against his shoulder, and he pressed his face into her hair, and outside the window the city of Seoul was exactly what it always was, enormous and indifferent and entirely unaware that in this kitchen, in this specific light, two people had found each other across the ruins of 20 years of waiting, and had decided with complete certainty to keep finding each other for every year that came after. Seong-min walked her mother down the aisle at their wedding. That was her mother's request and he had agreed to it without hesitation, and Zara had looked at both of them when her mother told her, standing in the kitchen in Atlanta on the trip they had taken in the fall, and had felt the enormous warm thing that she did not bother trying to name anymore because it was simply the thing she felt when everything was exactly right. They got married in Seoul in the spring, the same light as the garden morning, the ceremony attended by the people who had been there through all of it, Kim with his composure more or less intact until the vows. Director Shin with his 3-decade efficiency finally given something to organize that made him genuinely happy, her mother in a dress she had selected 3 months in advance and described to Zara in detail at least 4 times. Her brothers in suits they had not complained about, which was how she knew they genuinely liked Seong-min. And in the back row, in a seat that nobody had officially assigned but that everyone had simply understood was his, a man from his old organizational world who had been there since the beginning, and who wept through the entire ceremony with the committed totality of someone who had been waiting 21 years for their boss to have something worth weeping at. At the dinner after, Zara leaned against her husband's shoulder and he held her hand, and her mother was already in conversation with Kim across the table, in a combination of Korean and English that appeared to be functioning better than it had any right to, and the light was warm and the room was full, and she thought about a Monday morning with a clipboard and a worn strap and a pin that said, "Ask me about neuroplasticity." About a man at a window who had been sitting still for 20 years and the specific way he had looked at her when she told him that the window was not as closed as everyone had decided. She thought about beginnings. She thought about how the hardest thing to manufacture was the first thing. What came after was work, and she had never been afraid of the work. She looked at her husband and he looked at her and he said quietly, "What are you thinking?" She said, "I am thinking that everyone gave up on you." He said, "Yes," she said, "and you are still here." He looked at her with those dark eyes that she had been reading for over a year and knew better than most things she knew. He said, "Because you opened the window." She said, "The window was always open." He said, "I know that now." She said, "That is what matters." He covered her hand with his and the dinner went on around them, warm and loud and full, and it was exactly what it was supposed to be, which was everything.